I almost threw the file into a dumpster. If I had, I would have spent the rest of my life believing a lie. My name is Patricia Morgan. I was 71 years old when I found the dusty file that changed everything I thought I knew about my family. It happened on a cool October morning while I was cleaning out the attic of the house my husband and I had shared for more than 40 years. Harold had been gone nearly 5 years by then. Most of his belongings had already been sorted, donated, or stored away. The attic was one of the last places I had avoided, not because it was difficult to reach, but because it was full of memories. Every box seemed to contain a different chapter of our lives. Old Christmas decorations, school projects from my son Eric's childhood, faded vacation photographs, retirement papers. I spent hours moving boxes from one side of the room to the other. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight coming from a small attic window. My knees ached. My back hurt. More than once, I considered finishing the job another day. Then I noticed a narrow metal filing box pushed deep behind a stack of old storage bins. It looked forgotten. The latch was rusted. A thick layer of dust covered the lid. At first, I assumed it contained tax records or insurance paperwork from decades ago. I almost carried it straight downstairs without opening it. Instead, I brushed away the dust and lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of folders. Most were labeled with dates and subjects I recognized immediately. Mortgage information, investment summaries, property taxes. Then I noticed one folder without a label. Unlike the others, it appeared newer. My curiosity got the better of me. I opened it. The first page stopped me cold. It was not a tax document. It was not an insurance form. It was a financial record connected to a property investment I had never heard of. At first, I assumed there must be some mistake. I read the page again, then a third time. The document clearly referenced Harold. It also referenced a business entity I did not recognize. More surprising was a note attached to the front. Someone had written instructions indicating that certain records should remain together and be reviewed only with related files. I sat down on an old wooden trunk and stared at the papers in my lap. My heart was beating faster than it should have been. For years, I believed I understood every major part of our financial life. Harold and I were not wealthy people, but we shared everything. Or at least I thought we did. I continued turning pages. More unfamiliar names appeared. More references to accounts and assets I had never seen. Some documents were dated only months before Harold died. Others were created after his death. That detail bothered me most. How could there be records connected to him after he was gone that I knew nothing about? Eventually, I carried the entire filing box downstairs and placed it on my dining room table. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the room as I examined document after document. By evening, one thing was painfully clear. This was not an old collection of forgotten paperwork. It was a trail. And somewhere at the end of that trail was a truth someone never wanted me to find. Before I found that filing box, I believed I understood my family's history completely. Looking back now, that confidence seems almost unbelievable. The years after Harold died had been painful, but they were straightforward. My son Eric and my daughter-in-law Lauren helped me through every difficult step. They assisted with paperwork, organized appointments, met with financial advisors, and handled countless responsibilities I felt too overwhelmed to manage alone. I trusted them without hesitation. Eric was my only child. I remembered teaching him to ride a bicycle on our quiet suburban street. I remembered helping him with homework at the kitchen table and attending every school event no matter how busy life became. Trusting him never felt like a decision. It felt natural. Lauren seemed equally dependable. She was organized, confident, and always willing to help. After Harold passed away, she often volunteered to handle paperwork and communicate with various offices on my behalf. At the time, I viewed her involvement as kindness. If someone had suggested she might be hiding something from me, I would have dismissed the idea immediately. The day after discovering the file, I sat at my dining room table reviewing the documents again. Morning sunlight spilled through the windows while a pot of coffee cooled beside me. The more pages I examined, the more questions surfaced. Certain account numbers appeared repeatedly. Several business entities were unfamiliar. Most surprising of all were references to investments that never appeared in any financial summary I remembered receiving. Around noon, I called Eric. The conversation began normally. We talked about the weather and his work. Then I casually mentioned that I had been cleaning the attic and found some old paperwork. The reaction was subtle but noticeable. His voice changed. Not dramatically, just enough for me to hear it. He immediately asked what kind of paperwork I found. I explained that I was still sorting through everything. There was a brief silence. Then he suggested that most old financial records were probably outdated and not worth worrying about. The comment seemed harmless, yet something about it stayed with me. Later that afternoon, Lauren called. She said Eric mentioned my attic project and wanted to know whether I needed help organizing anything. Once again, the conversation sounded perfectly reasonable. Yet when I mentioned some of the investment documents, Lauren quickly assured me that Harold's affairs had already been settled years ago. Her answer arrived too fast, almost as if she had expected the question. After ending the call, I walked through my quiet house trying to clear my mind. Family photographs covered the walls. Pictures from birthdays, graduations, vacations, and holidays filled every room. Looking at them, I felt almost guilty for questioning the people I loved. Yet the documents sitting on my table refused to leave my thoughts. That evening, I returned to the filing box. Buried beneath several folders, I found a handwritten note attached to a stack of records. The handwriting belonged to Harold. I recognized it instantly. The note was short, only a few lines. But one sentence caught my attention immediately. He wrote that all related files should remain together because they provided important context for future discussions. Future discussions. I stared at those words for several minutes. Whatever Harold intended me to understand, he clearly expected someone to review these records someday. As darkness settled outside my windows, I realized the file was not simply revealing information. It was asking questions. And for the first time, I began to wonder whether the people closest to me already knew the answers. The next morning, I decided to stop guessing and start verifying. I carried the filing box into my home office and began sorting every document by date. What started as curiosity was slowly becoming an investigation. Some folders contained routine financial information. Others contained references to partnerships, investment properties, and accounts I had never heard Harold mention. The more organized the records became, the stranger they appeared. Several documents referenced a company name that surfaced repeatedly throughout the file. Yet despite years of handling paperwork after Harold's death, I had never seen that company listed anywhere else. Around noon, I drove to the county records office. I told myself I was simply looking for context. Nothing more. The building was small and quiet. Most of the people there seemed focused on property searches and permit requests. After providing a few names and dates, I gained access to public records connected to several properties mentioned in the file. What I found left me staring at the screen for several seconds. One of the properties had been connected to Harold for years. Yet ownership records showed activity long after his death. Not illegal activity. Not dramatic activity. Just transactions and updates I knew absolutely nothing about. Driving home, I felt a growing sense of unease. If these records were legitimate, someone had continued managing matters connected to Harold's investments without ever discussing them with me. That evening, Eric and Lauren stopped by unexpectedly. They brought dinner and acted as though everything was normal. We sat around the kitchen table discussing ordinary things. Work, weather, a neighbor's new puppy. Yet beneath every conversation, I felt the weight of the filing box waiting in the next room. Eventually, I decided to test something. I casually mentioned one of the property addresses I had discovered earlier that day. The reaction was immediate. Eric glanced toward Lauren before answering. The look lasted less than a second, but I noticed it. Lauren quickly smiled and asked where I had heard about that property. Her voice sounded light, curious, yet there was tension beneath it. I explained that I found some old paperwork while cleaning. For the first time all evening, neither of them seemed comfortable. Eric immediately assured me the property was not important. Lauren agreed. Then they both encouraged me not to worry about complicated records from the past. The conversation moved on. At least they wanted it to. After they left, I sat alone at the table replaying every word. People who know nothing rarely react so quickly. People who are hearing information for the first time usually ask questions. Eric and Lauren seemed more concerned with ending the discussion than understanding it. The realization unsettled me. Over the following week, I continued sorting documents. Slowly, a timeline emerged. Certain records matched dates when Harold traveled for business. Others matched conversations I vaguely remembered overhearing years earlier. Piece by piece, fragments of forgotten memories began connecting. Then, late one evening, I discovered something tucked inside the back of a folder. It was a copy of a letter written by Harold less than a year before he died. Most of the letter concerned routine financial matters. But one sentence stood out immediately. Harold wrote that complete records should remain available so there would never be confusion about ownership or future decisions. I read that sentence several times. Then I looked around the quiet room. If Harold wanted clarity, why had so many questions remained unanswered for so many years? And why did it suddenly feel like the people closest to me were hoping I would stop looking before I found the answer? The next breakthrough came from a place I never expected. It was not hidden inside the filing box. It was not buried in county records. It was sitting inside my own house the entire time. 3 days after finding Harold's letter, I decided to search through a collection of old storage containers in the basement. Most of them contained ordinary things. Holiday decorations, photo albums, household receipts, the sort of items people keep simply because they cannot bring themselves to throw them away. Hours passed with little progress. Then I found a cardboard box labeled simply business. The handwriting belonged to Harold. Inside were folders, notebooks, and several spiral-bound planners he used during the last years of his life. At first, nothing seemed remarkable. Then I noticed repeated references to the same company name I had seen in the attic file. Suddenly, my pulse quickened. I carried everything upstairs and spread it across the dining room table. For the rest of the afternoon, I compared dates, notes, and records. The planners contained appointment reminders, meeting notes, and handwritten observations. Slowly, a larger picture began emerging. Harold had been far more involved in these investments than I ever realized. More importantly, he carefully documented almost everything. Several entries referenced conversations about future ownership and long-term planning. In one notebook, I found a page folded neatly in half. Written across the top were the words, "For Patricia." My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. The note was brief. Harold explained that certain investments had been structured separately to simplify future transfers and protect assets. He specifically mentioned wanting complete transparency so I would never feel excluded from important decisions. I read the note 3 times. Then I sat back in my chair and stared at the wall. The contrast between Harold's intentions and what actually happened felt impossible to ignore. That evening, I called a former business associate of Harold's whose name appeared repeatedly throughout the planners. His name was Harold Bennett. I remembered meeting him years earlier at a retirement dinner. To my surprise, he remembered me immediately. We spoke for nearly an hour. During the conversation, he casually mentioned attending several meetings with Harold before his death. He also assumed I had been fully informed about everything afterward. When I explained that much of the information was new to me, a long silence followed. Then he said something I will never forget. "Patricia, that is not how Harold intended it." Those 6 words changed everything. Until that moment, I had been trying to determine whether there was a misunderstanding. After that conversation, I began asking a different question. If Harold wanted transparency, why did so many important details disappear after he died? The following day, I organized a timeline stretching back nearly 10 years. Investment records, property transfers, meeting dates, correspondence, notes from Harold. The more complete the timeline became, the more obvious the gaps appeared. Certain decisions occurred shortly after Harold's death. Certain communications stopped. Certain records shifted to different addresses. None of it looked accidental anymore. Late that night, I sat alone beneath the soft glow of a table lamp studying the documents spread across the room. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. Inside, my house felt filled with unanswered questions. Yet for the first time since finding the file, I also felt something else. Confidence. The truth was no longer hidden behind vague suspicions. It was beginning to take shape, and the shape it was forming pointed directly toward people I had trusted most. After speaking with Harold Bennett, I stopped treating the documents as isolated discoveries. Instead, I began treating them as evidence. Every evening, I sat at my dining room table and added new information to the timeline I had created. Dates, meetings, account changes, property records, handwritten notes, and correspondence slowly formed a complete picture. The process was tedious, but it revealed something important. The same names appeared repeatedly. The same decisions surfaced again and again. Most notably, Eric and Lauren seemed to be involved whenever information stopped reaching me. One afternoon, Harold Bennett called unexpectedly. He sounded hesitant. After exchanging a few pleasantries, he explained that he had spent the previous evening reviewing some of his own archived records. During that review, he found copies of correspondence exchanged shortly after Harold's death. Several of those communications referenced follow-up meetings regarding asset management and ownership transitions. Harold Bennett offered to send me copies. When the envelope arrived 2 days later, I opened it immediately. Inside were meeting summaries, appointment confirmations, and several pages of notes. None of them accused anyone of wrongdoing. Yet together they revealed something difficult to ignore. My name rarely appeared in discussions concerning assets that ultimately affected me. Eric's name appeared often. Lauren's name appeared as well. As I read through the documents, a pattern emerged that mirrored everything else I had discovered. Decisions were being discussed. Information was being exchanged. Plans were being made. Yet somehow I remained outside the conversation. That evening, I drove to a small cafe near the edge of town and met Harold Bennett in person. We sat near a window overlooking a quiet parking lot while autumn rain fell steadily outside. Harold spoke carefully. He explained that during Harold's final years, transparency had always been a priority. Whenever future planning was discussed, Harold emphasized the importance of keeping me informed. Hearing those words felt strangely comforting and heartbreaking at the same time. Comforting because they confirmed what I already suspected. Heartbreaking because they highlighted how far reality had drifted from Harold's intentions. Before leaving, Harold mentioned one final detail. According to his memory, there had been a discussion several years earlier regarding whether certain files should be consolidated and stored together. The purpose was to ensure that no important records would ever be overlooked. The comment immediately caught my attention. The old file from the attic suddenly seemed less accidental than before. Someone had gathered those records together intentionally. Someone knew they belonged in one place. Driving home through the rain, I thought about that possibility. What if the file was never meant to disappear? What if it was preserved precisely because Harold wanted someone to find it eventually? Later that night, I reviewed the documents again. Buried among the meeting notes was a reference to a financial review that occurred nearly 18 months after Harold's death. The meeting summary included a short remark written in the margin. It stated that future disclosures would remain limited until circumstances became more favorable. I stared at that sentence for a long time. Limited disclosures. The phrase felt cold and deliberate. More importantly, it confirmed something I had been reluctant to accept. Information had not simply been forgotten. Information had been managed, and the people managing it were not strangers. They were members of my own family. As I closed the folder and looked across the quiet room, I realized the mystery was no longer about whether something had been hidden. That question was already answered. The real question now was why they believed I should never know. The answer began revealing itself in small pieces rather than one dramatic discovery. During the weeks that followed, I focused on building the most complete timeline possible. Every document from the attic file, every note from Harold Bennett, every property record, and every piece of correspondence found its place on the dining room table. The process felt strangely personal. I was not simply reviewing financial records. I was reconstructing years of my own life. One afternoon, while comparing dates from several meeting summaries, I noticed something that immediately stood out. Certain decisions involving investments and property transfers occurred within days of conversations I remembered having with Eric and Lauren. At the time, those conversations seemed ordinary. Looking back, they suddenly appeared different. I remembered asking questions about financial matters and receiving reassuring answers that now felt carefully incomplete. The realization unsettled me. A few days later, Harold Bennett contacted me again. He had located additional records stored in an old archive box. Most of the material duplicated information I already possessed. Then he mentioned a collection of annual review summaries. According to Harold Bennett, these reports were designed specifically to keep beneficiaries informed about important developments. When the copies arrived, I immediately began reading them. The first report contained references to investment performance and property values. The second discussed administrative changes. The third included updates regarding ownership structures. What shocked me was not the content itself. It was the fact that I had never seen any of them before. Every report was addressed to me. Every report was intended for me. Yet none of them ever reached my hands. I spent that evening sitting quietly at the dining room table staring at the stack of papers. Outside, the first signs of winter were beginning to appear. The trees stood bare against the dark sky. Inside the house, The silence felt heavier than usual. For years, I assumed I had been fully informed. Now I was looking at proof that entire categories of information had been withheld. The following weekend, I attended a family gathering at Eric and Lauren's home. I almost declined the invitation. Part of me wanted more time before facing them again. In the end, I decided to go. The gathering itself was pleasant on the surface. Family members chatted about upcoming holidays. Children played in the backyard. Laughter drifted through the house. Yet beneath the ordinary atmosphere, I found myself paying attention to details I once ignored. Whenever financial topics surfaced, Lauren redirected the conversation almost immediately. Whenever someone mentioned Harold's old investments, Eric became noticeably uncomfortable. Neither reaction proved anything. Yet after everything I had learned, the pattern was difficult to dismiss. Later that evening, while helping clear dishes from the table, I overheard a brief exchange between Eric and Lauren in the kitchen. They lowered their voices when they noticed me nearby, but not before I heard one sentence. Lauren quietly asked whether certain records had been removed from storage years earlier. Eric responded with a nervous glance toward the dining room. The moment lasted only seconds. Still, it stayed with me the entire drive home. As I pulled into my driveway that night, I realized something important. The evidence was no longer pointing toward a simple misunderstanding. Too many documents were missing. Too many conversations felt rehearsed. Too many decisions had been made without my knowledge. And somewhere within the growing collection of records spread across my dining room table, I suspected the final piece of the puzzle was already waiting for me. The final piece appeared on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. By then, my dining room looked more like an archive room than a place where people shared meals. Documents covered nearly every surface. Timelines stretched across the table. Folders sat stacked in neat piles against the walls. For weeks, I had been searching for one thing: a direct connection. Something that would explain not only what happened, but why. Late that afternoon, I returned to the old filing box one more time. I had already examined every folder multiple times. At least, I thought I had. As I lifted the metal box to move it, I noticed something unusual. The bottom panel seemed thicker than it should have been. Curious, I turned the box over and inspected it more closely. A thin false divider had been installed inside. My heart immediately began racing. Carefully, I loosened the panel and slid it free. Beneath it sat a sealed manila envelope. No label. No markings. Just an envelope hidden where nobody would casually find it. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. Then I opened it. Inside were copies of correspondence dating back to the months following Harold's death. The first few pages seemed ordinary. Then I found a letter addressed to Eric. I recognized Harold's signature immediately. The contents left me speechless. Harold explained that certain investments and property interests would eventually transfer to me directly. He also emphasized that I should remain fully informed about every stage of the process. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. His instructions were crystal clear. As I continued reading, another document appeared. Then another. One was a summary of a meeting involving Eric and Lauren shortly after Harold's death. Another contained handwritten notes discussing how information would be presented to me moving forward. Several passages made my stomach tighten. The language repeatedly focused on controlling complexity and avoiding unnecessary discussions. Yet the overall effect was unmistakable. Important decisions were being made without my participation. What shocked me most was not the existence of the documents. It was how carefully they had been hidden. That evening, I called Harold Bennett and asked him to review the materials. He arrived the following day. Together, we spent hours comparing the newly discovered documents against everything already assembled in my timeline. The results were undeniable. Dates matched. Events aligned. Missing gaps disappeared. The hidden envelope connected every loose thread. More importantly, it exposed a contradiction that could not be explained away. Several actions taken after Harold's death directly conflicted with his written wishes. Harold Bennett sat quietly for several moments after reviewing everything. Finally, he removed his glasses and sighed. "Patricia," he said softly, "I think you finally have your answer." The room fell silent. Deep down, I knew he was right. The mystery that began with an old file was over. The evidence was complete. For the first time since opening that dusty box in the attic, I understood exactly what happened. The following evening, I called Eric. I told him there were documents we needed to discuss. He immediately sounded nervous. Lauren joined the conversation a few minutes later. Neither asked many questions. Somehow they already knew. Before ending the call, I told them I wanted everyone together the following weekend. No excuses. No delays. Just one conversation with every document on the table. After hanging up, I looked across the room at the timeline I had spent weeks building. The truth was finally complete. And for the first time, I realized that the difficult part was no longer discovering it. The difficult part would be watching everyone else confront it. The meeting took place the following Saturday afternoon at Eric and Lauren's house. The weather was cold and gray. Bare tree branches swayed outside the windows while a steady wind moved through the neighborhood. As I drove there, the binder containing months of research rested on the passenger seat beside me. For weeks, those documents had existed only in my world. By the end of the day, they would belong to everyone. When I arrived, the atmosphere felt tense immediately. Eric opened the door and greeted me politely, but his smile looked forced. Lauren stood in the kitchen arranging coffee cups and snacks on the counter. She appeared calm, almost too calm. Harold Bennett arrived a few minutes later. Several close relatives joined us as well. Everyone settled around the dining room table. The same type of table where countless family celebrations had taken place over the years. Birthdays, holidays, anniversaries. Today felt completely different. Once everyone was seated, Eric cleared his throat and suggested we focus on understanding the facts rather than assigning blame. The statement sounded reasonable, yet I could hear the nervousness beneath it. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then I opened the binder. I began with the attic file. I explained how I found it and why it caught my attention. From there, I moved through the timeline one step at a time. Property records, investment documents, correspondence, meeting summaries, notes written by Harold. At first, Lauren responded confidently. She insisted that every decision had been made with good intentions. She explained that she and Eric believed they were protecting me from complicated financial matters during a difficult period after Harold's death. Several relatives nodded sympathetically. A year earlier, that explanation might have ended the conversation. This time it did not. I continued presenting documents. One by one, the pieces began connecting. Harold's handwritten notes emphasized transparency. Meeting summaries showed decisions being discussed without me. Annual reports intended for me never reached my hands. Correspondence revealed information being filtered before it reached me. As the evidence accumulated across the table, the atmosphere changed. Eric attempted to defend several decisions. He argued that he was overwhelmed after losing his father. He insisted there was never any intention to cause harm. Listening to him, I believed some of what he said. Grief affects people in complicated ways. Yet grief did not explain years of withheld information. Then I presented the documents hidden inside the false compartment of the filing box. The room became completely silent. Harold's letter addressed to Eric left little room for interpretation. The instructions were clear. I was supposed to remain informed. I was supposed to participate in decisions. The records that followed demonstrated exactly how far reality had drifted from those instructions. Lauren's confidence began fading visibly. She no longer offered immediate explanations. Several times she glanced toward Eric before speaking. Across the table, relatives exchanged uneasy looks. For the first time, everyone was seeing the entire picture rather than isolated pieces. Then Eric picked up one of the hidden documents and read it again. His expression changed. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he compared it with another record. Then another. The room remained silent except for the turning of pages. Finally, one of the relatives asked a simple question. If Harold wanted Patricia informed, why was she excluded for so many years? Nobody answered immediately. The question hung in the air. Looking around the table, I realized something important. Nobody was arguing anymore. Nobody was dismissing concerns. Nobody was searching for quick explanations. For the first time since I opened that dusty file in the attic, everyone was confronting the same reality. And that reality was much harder to ignore than anyone expected. The silence that followed felt heavier than any accusation ever could. Around the table, people continued studying the documents spread before them. Property records, meeting summaries, annual reports, Harold's handwritten notes, the hidden letter addressed to Eric. Every page told the same story from a different angle. None of them supported the explanation everyone had relied on for years. Eric sat motionless, staring at the documents in front of him. Several times he picked up the same letter and read it again. The room remained quiet except for the occasional rustle of paper. Finally, he set the letter down and looked toward me. For the first time that afternoon, there was no defensiveness in his expression, only regret. Lauren remained silent beside him. The confidence she carried at the beginning of the meeting had disappeared completely. One of the relatives asked another question. Why were the annual reports never delivered to Patricia? Nobody answered immediately. Then Eric spoke. His voice sounded tired. He admitted that after Harold died, he and Lauren believed they were helping by managing complicated matters themselves. At first, they intended to keep me informed eventually. Then one decision led to another. One delay became another delay. Information became easier to filter than explain. Listening to him, I realized something important. The truth was not dramatic. There had been no elaborate conspiracy, no stolen fortune hidden in secret accounts. The betrayal came from something simpler and, in many ways, more painful. They decided what I should know and what I should not know. They convinced themselves it was for my benefit. Over time, those decisions became normal. Harold Bennett quietly explained how easily situations like that can grow. Temporary arrangements become permanent. Assumptions replace communication. Before anyone realizes it, years have passed. Looking around the table, I could see relatives beginning to understand. This was never about money alone. It was about trust. It was about respect. It was about being treated as though I were incapable of understanding my own life. Eventually, Eric stood and walked toward the window. Outside, the late afternoon sky was beginning to darken. Bare branches swayed in the cold wind. For several moments, he simply stared outside. Then he turned back toward me and apologized. Not for one specific document or one specific decision. He apologized for years of choices that slowly moved me farther away from information that belonged to me. The room remained quiet as he spoke. Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. The facts had already settled every debate. By the time the meeting ended, the atmosphere felt completely different from when it began. People gathered there, coats, and prepared to leave. Several relatives stopped to speak with me privately. Some apologized for making assumptions. Others admitted they never questioned the situation because they trusted the explanations they were given. As I stepped outside, cold air filled my lungs. The sky above the neighborhood glowed with the final colors of sunset. For a moment, I stood beside my car looking back at the house. Months earlier, I thought the old file would reveal a hidden investment or forgotten property. Instead, it revealed something much larger. It revealed how easily truth can disappear when people stop sharing it. The drive home felt peaceful. The binder rested on the passenger seat beside me, no longer a mystery waiting to be solved. When I arrived home, I carried it inside and placed it on the dining room table where this journey began. Then I looked toward the attic staircase. One dusty filing box. One forgotten folder. One decision to open it instead of throwing it away. That was all it took. Sometimes the truth hides for years. But eventually, if it is important enough, it finds a way to be seen.